Welcome. My name is Martin Bakker. I'm trained as a physical chemist, and in particular the last couple of decades, that's led me into the materials of self-organizing, self-assembling systems. In particular, part of this is inorganic synthesis, where we make these materials in glass or silica. And then more recently, we transitioned into carbon-based materials, for which we're doing organic metallic synthesis, so we can incorporate transition metals into an ordered carbon phase and utilize that for catalysis. I like big pictures and big ideas. So here's sort of the intro to self-organization, self-assembly. Here are some cases of the same structural motif at lots of different length scales. On the left-hand side, all the simple examples, non-biological processes. On the right-hand side, a biological process that uses the same motif. The sort of motif we use is, well, here was one example. This is hexagonal, so you see the Giant's Causeway, a honeycomb, and these are metal oxide nanopillars that we've made using a self-assembly process. I'd say that we look at simple cases of self-assembly, so that, for instance, the one example here, we only vary really the composition or nature of 4 components, very straightforward, and 4 very simple polymeric components. Contrast this with in nature, where, say, COVID-19 is 29,000 base pairs, so it has a lot of information. Even the virus, the Moderna virus, is about 1,300. So again, high information systems. My interest is in low information systems because it's here that we can see the fundamental properties at work. We simplify things to make it easier for us to understand it. That simplification, that idea of using fundamentals, is the basis for a lot of science. It's also what employers value, in particular because once you have the fundamentals down, you can then apply those, use science to predict, what should be happening, test that, and you solve problems with that. Same is true with the funding agencies, where folks, we have a lot of big problems. So the biggest I'd say is this is the Earth. We think of it being large, but the part of it we inhabit is actually a pretty small space. It's only about 8 miles thick. You can walk that in about 2.5 hours. We have ever more people wanting a higher standard of living, using more and more resources, and generating more and more waste. And so we have lots of problems potentially to apply our fundamental understanding to. So let me give you a very quick introduction to self-assembly. You take a very simple molecule like a detergent. As you increase its concentration in water, it goes from being individual molecules to being balls, which we call micelles. Add more surfactant still, you get more micelles, and then some of those micelles start to merge. You can get, say, rods. At high concentration still, those rods can then self-assemble into what's called liquid crystalline phase. That's an example of a soft material. If we now put a monomer, like a silica monomer or a carbon monomer, we can in there, let it polarize, we can now take that soft structure and turn it into a harder, durable material. Very high surface area, because these materials have porosity at about the 2 to 5 nanometer scale. The joke we use is that we can put the surface of a football field into a teaspoon of material. To get stuff to and from that surface is very difficult, so you want more porosity. And a way of doing that is by a second self-assembling method. This is still a phase separation. So if you say take a solution, and then you change its properties. So you say decrease the temperature, or you let a polymer form so that the monomer is soluble, the polymeric material ever less so. Eventually they'll phase separate. And if you let it go long enough, you'll get literally 2 phases, and they'll be macro phase separated. If you can freeze that part way through, you can freeze in some of these structures, and it's easiest for me to actually show this. This is a model we've made of a X-ray tomography data set from one of our materials. This is about a 2,000-fold magnification, and I'll let it roll a little bit. So you get a sense of, these are pores that run all the way through the material. So this is what we call a bicontinuous material. And then the surface, you can see those white surfaces are actually formed of mesopores. So you get large pores, macropores, micrometer size, and connected to small pores. We call these hierarchically porous materials because they have 2 or more specific length scales. They're already, variants on this are already used. Well, the engineers call these monolithic materials if you make them in one single piece, which is what we routinely do. These are used in your catalytic converter because you get very good mass transport through the monolith. I point out that the engineers use 125 micrometer pores, fairly large ones. Our material here, we're looking at about 5 micrometers. Means much higher surface area, which means more activity. We can do a lot of different things with this, and so this sort of gives you a sense. I'm going to talk most about fixed bed catalysis and maybe mention fuel cells if the end of time allows. As part of this, a few years back, I did a startup company with one of my graduate students. I'm still under NDA with them. They've had about $1.5 million funding from federal agencies and from investors. I was involved early on when we were scaling from very small scale, from 1 gram up to 15 grams, 40 grams, 100 kilograms a year, then 2 tons, and most recently they've scaled up to the capacity of 500 tons a year. It's a polymeric process. They make polymers, which they then convert to carbon by heating to high temperature. The wrinkle we've done with that since is that we've been modifying the procedures, saying, can we make these catalysts in one pot by adding metal to them? And the answer is yes, we did it with palladium. Particles are very large. The conversion is okay. It's not wild, but it's pretty good. Better with nickel, but still not quite as good as we think it should be, and still not good enough for actually application. In doing this, we've come to know a fair bit more, understand the recipe and procedure a lot better. There are 6 components, and unfortunately the metals tend to interfere with one of them. We can then go a step further, say, okay, what happens if we bind up the metal in an organic complex so that it can't interfere? Does that improve things? The answer is yes, sort of. We've done some dynamic light scattering, it does do catalysis, but we use fluorescence and fluorescence quenching, fluorescence, dynamic light scattering. What we find is actually that this particular complex isn't terribly soluble. It actually removes the detergent that's the templating agent. We're taking a step further from that and say, hey, can we now find something that is both more soluble and also, if it's stable to the 500 degrees that we heat things up to, maybe we've already got we can do a catalyst of a different form. With these phthalocyanine dyes, which are commercially available, we've used EPR to show that yes, the dye survives up to 500. They're not all the same. So one dye, for instance, doesn't actually get incorporated in the carbon. So you can actually wash it out after you've made it. That's the blue color. But another form does. It doesn't wash out, and actually we can sort of see from the fluorescence where it's resident. It's actually associated with the detergent. It's catalytically active, and it's not bad. Taking the next step, we want to be able to control where the dye sits inside the carbon. And so we've basically been doing some organic chemistry, making these phthalocyanine dyes and incorporating a PEG group, PEG side chains, which makes them soluble in the surfactant. So far, it looks pretty good. And we're hoping to actually modify exactly where that sits. Where we go with this is we're going to put it into a reactor column, so one-piece reactors, and we're working with actually 2 different chemical engineering groups to look at the chemistry of those, so we can do gas phase catalysis. And we can also then take that carbon and with a little processing beforehand, make really what we think are really good fuel cell electrodes. We should get really good mass transport through them, and so much more effective, assuming we can get the catalysis to work correctly. And this sort of shows you we can make these very thin discs of the material. Another wrinkle of the self-assembly that sort of relates into the phthalocyanine work, we've recently had NSF funding just starting to do phthalocyanines and zeolites. That's with Jamie Harris's group. We'll be doing the synthesis and the EPR. So My group typically has ranged from 2 or 3 graduate students up to 5 or 6 at some times. Most of the work I showed you is actually read at Hikari. Ambar has done the synthesis. I have a new student who's just starting on the EPR. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Obviously not in real time. Here's my email address. Feel free to email me about this.